Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of Ruby Rogues. This week, I guess I am your host, Charles Max Wood, and we are talking to Rich. Is it Steinmetz? Is that how you say your name? Did I get anywhere close?
Yeah, it was good in the American sense. Otherwise,
Right, I'm not German, so
um, in German,
how
it
do you
would
say
be
it in Germany?
Steinmetz.
Steinmetz. Oh, okay.
Yeah, hello. Nice to be here for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm just going to put it out there. We have talked plenty of times. You were in the book club, and, we might talk a little bit about that. Anyway, I think I ran across your blog post back when I was working my previous contract. And this blog post talks a bit about how to test loggers. And it was something that I hadn't really ever thought about. And just to give a little bit of context so that people kind of understand, why this became a thing, at least for me. And then I'd love to hear your story about why you even cared about testing loggers in your own case, right? But so what I was doing is I was writing integrations between two systems. So, you have the API over here for the company that I was contracted to, and an API over here for some third-party thing. And yeah, it was real exciting work, right? I pulled data out of one side and I translate it and put it in the other side, right?
Yeah.
And
Quite long.
right, yeah. Fascinating work. Anyway, one thing that was kind of interesting about the way that it was set up, though, was that they were using another piece of third-party software to actually run the integrations. And so what they were hoping to do was effectively create kind of an app store for people integrating with their system to be able to integrate with any of these other third-party systems, right? So what they did was like shipping and logistics. And so then you have, and warehousing. And so on the other end, you might have some other ERP system or, some other system that kept track of inventory or this or that, and some of these were like brick and mortar stores and some of them were e-commerce. And so, right, having it integrate across so you could, send data back and forth to and from Shopify or whatever. So I'd list some of the other integrations I built, but you've never heard of these companies. I hadn't before I wrote them. So anyway, this system, the way that it worked was the only log you really had was standard out and standard error on the command line. And so, but we wanted a logged format that would log the data. And then eventually we also hooked into another logging system that I can't remember the name of, and it'll come to me at some point. Right. So we wanted to check that it was logging to this internet system, and then it was logging to standard out and standard error using the format that we used and things like that. Right. And so since that was the only information we had and it kept a log, right, it kept that as the log, the output. Logging became kind of important, right? So typically when I'm doing logging, I'm just, I'm putting stuff out into a file, right? Or Rails is doing it or whatever. And so, it doesn't matter, right? Because ultimately, if the information's there and I need it to debug something, then I'll do that. But even then, I typically have like a Sentry or Raygun or something set up to capture actual errors. So it's only if something happens that doesn't generate an exception do I actually need the logs. And so I usually just don't care about the logs. But in this case, I did. And so I was out looking for a solution. Hey, how do I test the logger and make sure that the right information's getting put out there, right? And yeah, I found your stuff. And so
Did you find a good way to do that when you looked into it?
There were a couple of ways that I found to do it, but before we get to that, I'm kind of curious what your story is. Like, what made you think, oh, I'm going to test loggers, right?
Yeah, most of the time loggers don't get much love, right? They kind of do their thing, and as you said, you just look into them whenever you need it, and you don't really care. I notice that sometimes especially in this case, I did some test-driven development.
Mm-hmm.
And when test driving something, and it was a very back-end heavy thing, in any case, whenever you test something, you want to test the behavior, right? And since this was like a very back-end heavy thing,
Mm-hmm.
the only behavior in some cases was that there was a log output.
Okay.
And the log output, well, sometimes it was really, really simple. Sometimes it was a little bit more complex with dynamic expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there were different cases that basically, as an example, there was a conversion in this specific blog post that you found. And this conversion could go uh, in the right way, and then the user would have their duplicated whatever it was thing that they kind of
Mm-hmm.
copied, or there could have been like 7 things that go wrong, in which case the user, well, there's always one thing that happens: the user doesn't get their copy, but then
Mm-hmm.
there's also some part of the behavior that's important to us internally, which is well, what did go wrong? It was really like crucial for us to know so we can um, recover. And we needed like the extra information in the log, and it was important for us to log the right thing. So
Right.
um, yeah, and this is basically where I started my journey with testing loggers. I did this before as well, actually, and I noticed that there are a lot of ways also to test loggers.
Uh-huh.
Um, in my blog post, I proposed one way, which is, I'm not sure if this is something that from your story that you were looking for, because what I'm doing there, I'm just making sure that the right logger logs the right thing. That
Right.
basically the expected output is passed to the logger, and I
Mm-hmm.
kind of trust that it logs to standard out or wherever.
Right.
But then there is also this notion of you actually want to test that it went to standard out. And I think there's even like a minitest helper that does this.
I don't know. I didn't test that either. I only tested that the information got passed to the logger function.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I think this is the easy route, right?
mm-hmm.
Um, to go and make sure that at least it's going the right way.
Yep.
There is, yeah. You could also theoretically, you could also do, if it's really important to you, and maybe there are people who test really everything, and you
Right.
could even like check that the file has the right output.
Yeah, I mean that did occur to me, but it felt like overkill. Right? Checking standard out
It is,
felt
it
like
is.
overkill. Um, it looks like in your examples, I mean, one of the things that I ran into was um, I was just using the Ruby logger class because I wasn't
Hmm.
in Rails. Now it works basically like the Rails logger class, so the interface is pretty much identical. It's not a stretch, but yeah, it looks like you were using Rails logger, and then the other thing I'll throw in is that um, you you were using minitest and I was using RSpec. So
Yeah, that can also lead to different solutions, but in the end, I
yeah.
think it's a little bit more or less the same in
Hmm.
terms of, yeah, you stop this thing out and you expect this and this input to go to Ruby log method or
Yeah.
whatever method or instance you used. Yeah, I just saw there is a assert log method
Mm.
in uh, in Minitest, and you give it a string as a parameter as an argument, and then inside of the block, you
Uh-huh.
can run your code, and it tests for, basically it asserts
Mm-hmm.
the right thing got logged there. Yeah. So this is kind of built into minitest, and I used it in one of my testing workshops for a bootcamp that I did, but I don't know if RSpec has a similar thing actually.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't know that minitest had it. So I
Yeah.
was testing it the way that you were, as far as just doing mine was a little more involved. I actually would create a mock, and so I would use the double method in RSpec to create a mock of the logger,
Mm-hmm.
and then I would just say it should receive info with whatever line. And so
Mm-hmm.
then if I had the formatting built into my logger, right, because I created my own logger class, and I totally cheated. I made it into a singleton. I know people are throwing up their mouths when I say that, but what it meant was that I only had to load it one time, right? So I could go and I could tell everything, hey, include logger, and then when I did logger.new or whatever, or logger.instance, I think is what it is for singletons, right? It just, I didn't have to reinstantiate it because it already existed in the program. But yeah, so
Yeah.
then it always returned that double, or that mock, and then from there I would just test it, and I would say, hey, did it receive this message? And what's interesting is that I could also mock the Ruby logger, and so I would pass the message into my logger, my custom logger, and then I could test that the Ruby logger actually got the formatted message with the data that I, right, because it reformatted it and put a timestamp on it and stuff, and so I could test them
Mm-hmm.
both. But yeah, I don't see anything in RSpec that does the assert log, so I had to do test doubles.
Yeah. 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 It's interesting. Did you use like the singleton in your app? So basically, all the logs went through the same instance, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Of the logger. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, what I did here, what I've done here is I've used some dependency injection there,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't initially my idea. In Rails, you can just do like Rails logger,
Right.
and then does Rails logger actually every time create a new instance?
I don't know. I actually
I
don't know the
think so,
answer to that.
because I ended up, I might be wrong now, but I ended up uh, finding it useful to have this as dependency injection, the logger itself, because
Mm-hmm.
I remember, at least in our case, if I didn't do that, then basically it was two different loggers um, using
Mm-hmm.
like Rails logger, and then what you could do, of course, you could do Rails logger any instance or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and which would be kind of a mock as well, and then it would get the method, and yeah, it would just work for any. But then the dependency injection allowed for using the exact logger.
Right. That makes sense. Yep. And so for
And it
those
was
that
kind of,
aren't familiar with dependency injection, effectively what we're talking about is, and you can see it in the blog post if you want to go read it, folks. But yeah, you have a keyword argument that's logger, and it defaults to rails.logger. But what happens is, yeah, then you can pass in the actual logger you want to test against, whether that's a test double or an object that's stubbed out, and you can get the behavior you expect without having to wrangle anything extra or figure out how Rails works.
yeah. And you end up doing a lot of this when you do TDD
Mm-hmm.
because and like quote unquote good testing because it's like it's said to be not an optimal thing to run any instance anywhere. There's a saying that if you have any instance somewhere or like a mock, that you have a design problem, most probably. And in this case, though, it was useful. And first, in the beginning, I didn't go for the dependency injection, but in a review, we figured out that could
Mm-hmm.
be a good thing because in this particular case, the logger was also supposed maybe in future to be configurable.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the, in this case, whenever you have something that's configurable and can be called from several callers, can be good to make it like a dependency injection instead of like a hard dependency inside of the instance.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Most of the time, so I've seen dependency injection used, like you're saying, for testing. I think the other place that I've seen it is um, Angular uses it pretty heavily. And
Okay.
so,
Yeah.
but and so you can drop different services in and swap out API systems and stuff like that. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, it makes sense here because then you can control what logger you're using and which APIs you expect it to hit.
Yeah. I'm curious. You said that you needed this kind of a thing, but you usually don't test logging because you just use it whatever comes out.
Mm-hmm.
But you needed this in this particular case because there was a little bit kind of a team requirement for that,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. So the logging output was actually significant to being able to check the work, that the work
yeah.
was done, right? It was, the logging was actually saying we grabbed this object and translated it and put it here. And then we grabbed
Mm-hmm.
this object and grabbed it and translated and put it here. And then after a while, it was all evented. And so then it was, hey, we picked up the next event and triggered it and executed it, and it did its thing. And so if so, the system was, I have to say, so the system they were using, and I'm not going to say the name of the company, but it wasn't super reliable. And so that was the other piece of the issue, was that you would have weird issues just running it, right?
Mm-hmm.
They had a hard 10-minute timeout, and so at 10 minutes it literally would just kill your, I think it was running on Docker or something. I think it just killed the whole container. I mean,
Okay.
midstream, just right. And so if you wanted to know if you had 10 million records to get through on a run, right, it would batch them through, but you
Mm.
wanted to know how far it got, and that it picked up the next one on the next run. And so, and that it properly logged, because it was actually, keeping track in another system. We finally built that. We built all these systems to compensate for the unreliability of this main system. But, eventually we were logging to the other system that the event was completed, right? So that it would not trigger again. But yeah, for a long time, I mean, that was the only way to know, was to go and actually search the log. And so,
Yeah.
they'd go look in the one system and, oh, it's not over here. So then you know, they'd look in the log and say, did it grab it? Did it move it? And the answer was usually, yep. But, or, hey, there was an issue putting that one in because the network went out in the middle of it, which happened more than once. So yeah, so it was a critical component to being able to communicate about what was getting done for the team.
Yeah.
So
Did you, by the way, have you worked a lot with minitest before?
I have. So this last contract, they were our spec. My current contract is our spec, but before that, when I was working for Morgan Stanley, all of our tests were written in mini test,
Okay,
and
maybe you can.
some of them were written in the class, and then def test whatever, and some of them were written
Hmm.
with mini spec, syntax, and so I've used them both
Yeah,
within the last year three.
maybe you can refresh my memory because I'm actually on my first. Well, I'm doing it now for 1.5 years. With my current contract, I'm writing almost only mini tests and also my personal
Mm-hmm.
project. And before that, I did 1.5 years RSpec.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a couple of examples in my blog posts where, well, the logger logs calls the info method 3 times, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's always I kind of send an info to the center out.
Right.
And so in mini tests, I really kind of struggled, especially in the beginning, with the syntax where you and maybe there's a better solution to that. And I kind of think it is more readable and more workable in RSpec, but maybe it's not. But when you do these mocks where you say logger expects like info
Mm-hmm.
3 times, and then you need to say with, and then you need to pass a block
Right.
in which you well, how do you say it to the words where um, you have the in the block you have the parameter as the actual
Mm-hmm.
string that's passed to the info method, and then you need to kind of compare it with inputs that you expect. And for this, you need like an array where you put in the inputs, and you
Mm-hmm.
need to shift it. It's probably very complicated to explain it in words, and
Right.
but
Well, I'm looking at the code, so I kind of follow what you're saying. Um,
okay,
and to be honest, I mean, a lot of this is just going to come down to taste. But yeah, so essentially, yeah, you wind up um, looping over the array and telling it that, yeah, it has to um, have an expected value that matches, the next thing in the array.
yeah,
Typically, what I wind up doing, unless I just have a really long list of things, in which case I start looking at my test and evaluating whether or not my test is actually testing more than I need tested, right? Because you don't have to test every
mm,
minute detail of everything, right? It has to be able to give you confidence that your code is correct. And
oh yeah,
so, but yeah, I've done this where I've put outputs, strings or values, objects, Rails models into an array, used a
mm,
factory to create them. And then, yeah, typically the way I've done it though is I actually just loop over the array and then call essentially in your case, logger expects to be called with info 3 times or without the 3 times, right? Expects to be called with info with the first, with the item as I loop over it. And often it just wants those to be in order.
mm,
In our spec, that seems to be what I remember. And so if I call the
yeah,
logger expects to be called with the value, and then logger expects to be called with another value, and then logger expects to be called with another value, as long as those values are in order, it's okay. And so I often won't even use the loop if I'm calling it 3 or 4 times. It's when you get into, okay, I have a dozen of these, right? Then I start looking at the loop and going, okay, I'm willing to sacrifice the readability of having the string right there where I'm asserting something in order to keep the test concise. But
yeah. Yeah, the thing is, I also remember doing it, what you are saying, and it seems to me like the more reasonable thing to do. But at least in this, I'm using here Mocha library and minitest, right? So at
Mm-hmm.
least with these technologies, you end up, if you have two expectations, basically two mocks, and the Mocha library calls it a mock, right? So if you have two mocks with the same method name, it can determine kind of which one you are referring to, or it takes the first or the last or something like that. And then you are bound to the syntax of saying logger expects method name so
Mm-hmm.
many times or an arbitrary amount of times or whatever. And yeah, you end up with this whole block thing and comparison thing with the
Yeah.
array stuff like that. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
interesting.
I opt for readability over um concision in my code as much as I can. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
if you have 100 things that you're testing, your test is probably way too big for one, or some of those tests should be moved into unit tests, right? And so then your integration test, you're not testing that it's logging a bunch of times. You're just testing the basically the back and forth between the programs or between the elements in your code. But yeah, I don't mind having long test methods or long test
Yeah,
blocks, right? In order to just be absolutely clear, this is what I'm looking for. So,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
doing a
In the
loop or
big,
something like that, a lot of times that, somebody who's been doing Ruby for 10 minutes can figure it out. So,
yeah, yeah. In the beginning, you also laughed a little bit about me saying that I love the API stuff, but I think at least I actually meant it. Like APIs
oh,
are one of my one of my
APIs are
yeah,
interesting, but yeah, go ahead.
sending data around. Yeah, sending data around that's like too simple or too like
Hmm.
rough work, right? Sometimes it's rough work. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So the issues that I had were basically two problems. One was that the API documentation, I was going to say it was poor documentation, but it wasn't actually correct documentation. And so when it was
Right.
wrong, it cost me days to figure out what the difference was.
Yeah.
And reaching out to their support, I would get a reply about a week later. And so by then I'd usually figured it out.
Oh
And on
wow.
the occasion where I hadn't, right, I'd been banging my head against the wall for a week, and that was frustrating. But the other issue is that yeah, I mean, if you have a straightforward API that you're translating data from into another straightforward API, it's really not that interesting of work because it's literally go get this JSON and go translate it to this other JSON, right? And so you're not doing work that's really that interesting, except for occasionally the mapping gets a little bit hairy. And so that's kind of fun because then you're attacking this. Oh, how do I get this data that they put on this entity? They store it in this nested entity in this way, and it's weird. And so, yeah, you have a problem to solve. But yeah, I didn't find it
Yeah.
that interesting. But
Yeah.
working with APIs itself, that's fun. Like right now, I'm working on expanding. So there's an active campaign gem. Um, active campaigns an email system that I use for top end
Mm.
devs, right? And so I'm going to
Yeah.
start. If you're on my list, you're going to start getting emails from me again. Yay! But yeah, so what I was working on was in top end devs. If you go to the top end devs main site, there's a form there that you can put your email address in, and it'll send you an email that says, if you use this RSS feed link, then you can get 7 episodes of a otherwise unavailable podcast that'll teach you how to advance your career and build momentum in your career, right? Because this is something that I've talked to
Nice.
dozens of people about, and it's like I feel stuck. I don't see how I'm going to advance in my career. I want to be senior developer. I'd like to get paid more, right? And so I was like, well, hey, do these things, you'll build your skills, you'll build your network, and you'll build your personal brand, and people will hire you. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, there are 7 or 8 episodes. I'm finishing the last of them tonight, and then I get them all posted and stuff. But anyway, so if you
Right.
put it in, I want the email to go out with the RSS link, but then I also want to subscribe you to a campaign, an active campaign that says, hey, here's episode 1, and here's what it's about. And then you get episode 2, and here's what it's about. And so I had to connect to the active campaign API, and all of the active campaign gems that I could find were out of date except for one. And all that one had really done was it had taken your API key for active campaign and translated that into a token, and then basically gave you convenience methods on REST client, I think is what it's built on. But
Mm-hmm.
you still have to specify. So you don't tell it, I want to create a contact. You tell it, I want to post to the endpoint called /contact with this JSON data, right? And then it just takes care of the auth part of it for you. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I want to be able to say active campaign :contact.create, here's the data, right? And
Yeah.
so I've been building on top of that, right? And so that kind of API works kind of fun because it's like, hey, how do I make it do a thing, right? How do I go and how far can I take this as far as automating this process? So that's fun.
Yeah. 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 At my current company, Webinar Geek, it's a webinar SaaS
Mm-hmm.
software, and we do quite a bit of integrations. Also, one of them is
Right.
also Active Campaign, and it's kind of, I also find it fun to also find the right wrapper around
Mm-hmm.
the API, and then like you said, make it do the right thing, and that it looks the right way on the other end
Right.
for the user. Um, the, for your personal kind of project. By the way, I was today at Top and Devs on the homepage, and I watched the video that looked really good.
Mm-hmm.
I also left my email there. Um, for the API that you are integrating now, like do you do some testing? What's your approach generally, maybe in terms of testing APIs apart from
Right.
loggers?
So I'm probably going to make some people sad because I don't love all of the options. And to be perfectly honest, right, if I'm running my tests, I don't want it hitting a live API somewhere. And as far as I've been able to see, like with Active Campaign, they don't really have a sandbox setup. Like when I'm writing stuff against Stripe, I put in a test key and it does the stuff, right? And so if I'm doing like a full on integration, hey, this plays nice with Stripe, and I know that it plays nice with Stripe, it's because it will go do stuff on Stripe, right? But the problem is that those tests tend to take longer, right? Because it's talking over the internet, and it's and so I have to wait for a response, and then what have you. And it doesn't take too terribly long, but if I have a large number of tests, then it will take a while, right? So I've
Yeah.
used VCR as a gem, and there are things I like and things I don't. If I
Mm,
remember correctly, the last time I used it, you could actually automate it so that every like 10 days or every, however
yeah.
long or however many tries, it'll
It,
it'll go get you a different it'll delete the cassette, the JSON file, and make a new one. And so
yeah. Yeah.
you're
Maybe,
never
maybe,
that
maybe,
far out of date.
maybe for context, like VCR
Right.
does record the actual API request into
Mm-hmm.
files and saves it basically in your repository, and then all subsequential tests will use this YAML
Right.
file. And it's called a cassette, and then you can automatically re-record it. Yeah, sorry,
Right.
interrupted you there.
No, I appreciate it because I always forget that we have people that are new to Ruby even these days, right? And so
Sure.
it's good to remember. But so I've used VCR, and there are a lot of things I like about it. But typically the way that I approach it, because that's one level of testing it, right? Because effectively you wind up testing it at the level of using HTTP party or REST client or net HTTP, right? So that's what VCR is testing is, you know, hey, at the lowest level, here's the data you get back, and then here's how so you're testing whatever integrations live on top of it from there, right? So if you have like what I'm working on where it translates active campaign responses into objects that I can, I have a bunch of convenience methods on that I can do stuff with, right? So I can test those and I can say, okay, get me the thing, and it just, it rehydrates a cassette, right? Um,
Yeah.
but typically what I have is I have some layer on top of the API request, like the direct, here's the path, here's the data, here's the auth, right? So go make the request for me. I have something sitting on top of that, right? And so in this case, it's I forked the Active Campaign simple client. I can't remember exactly
Mm-hmm.
what it's called, but it's something like that. That gem,
Yeah.
right? So I have a fork on it on GitHub, and I've just barely started adding this stuff. And so I probably either try and PR and contribute it back, and then if that's not the direction that the author intended it to go, then I'll just fork it and make his client dependency of my client, um,
Yeah.
or just keep
Interesting.
things as they are and then just deviate where I want. But anyway, so yeah, so I've got like a contact class on top, and I've got a tag class on top, and so I have a method on contact that's add tag, right? And so then it goes and it makes
Mm-hmm.
the call to contact tag. I don't know why I shouldn't complain about their API, but I don't understand why Active Campaign doesn't have a create contact with a tag option on it, so you can just do it in one call. But they don't, right? So I have to create that, and if the tag doesn't exist, I have to create it, and then I have to put them together.
Yeah.
Or I can go add them through the UI, and then But anyway, um, so then what I wind up doing is I just wind up testing that level of thing, and then I use some form of, I wouldn't say it's dependency injection so much as it's so typically I have like a retrieve method and a new method, and so the new method will take the data structure, the JSON, um, from the request. And so what that means is that if I want to unit test the the contact class and make sure that it's giving me the data back or what have you, or makes the proper call under the hood, then I can mock out the call library, because I assume that it works, right? I assume the HTTP party or REST client does the right thing. I'm not going to test that. They test that, right? Um, I test that when it doesn't work as I expect, is basically when I
Yeah.
hit it. So so I just stub that sucker out so that it doesn't make a call out to the endpoint on the other end, and then I'll test everything in there. And then usually I'll have some level of integration test that says, hey, if you retrieve this, it should behave this way. But then I'm not testing
Mm.
every method on there. I'm just testing, hey, I got data back as I expected, and I'm getting this contact with this information and this stuff. But even then, um it's tricky, right? Because a lot of times you're doing authentication that requires secrets, right? So you have an API key, or you have, like a public key and a secret key, like Stripe does, or something like that, right? And you
Yeah.
don't want those in your tests. And so what you have to do is you have to give the user a way to configure it with a .env file or something, so that they can run the tests on their own system. But then you also have to give them a method, and this is why I don't love some of this stuff, is because then you have to give them a way of effectively seeding the data into the system in the first place, in an easy and repeatable way in order to do it. Or you wind up having those VCR cassettes, and just
Mm.
making sure that they're checked in so that when they run it, right, it always uses the stored data. But the other issue you run into with VCR is that a lot of times, like for me with the I'm doing developer training, and so I don't fall under any regulations other than like the generic ones like GDPR or California's privacy law. I think Virginia passed a privacy law here in the U.S., right? And so I have to comply with
Hmm.
those if I want people in those areas to buy my stuff, but I don't have to comply with like FERPA, which is student privacy in the U.S., or um, I use Stripe for my payment system, so I don't have to fall under PCI compliance, right? Because that data never hits my system, and so I don't have to protect it. But um, it's possible for me to run a VCR against a system that does pull back some kind of like student data or something like that, right? And so I have to be
Hmm.
careful from there, right? Because I don't want to give away anybody else's information either, right? Now, if I always hit and I always get a contact that's me and it's my information, right? I can give that away if I want. But yeah, if I have it hit active campaign, is the example we've been using, or something else, and it pulls your information and puts it in a VCR cassette, then that's not okay. And so you have to play. This is the issue that I run into, right? And so um, sometimes what I do is I just pull the VCR cassette in once, and then I modify the data before I commit it, and then I just tell it never to refresh it. But the problem you run into
Hmm.
with that is then if the API changes or if the data output changes, then you're testing for a scenario that's no longer valid. And
Yeah.
so it's a tricky thing to handle. The other thing that I have done though is I've stubbed out um, doing the HTTP party request or the REST client request, and then effectively just testing the return values to make sure that they are what I want, right? So if I'm only pulling the contact email address, name, and phone number, then I only test those fields. And that way, if the overall response they add other fields to it or things like that, I'm just not testing those, right? So as long as those three things remain consistent, then I'm okay.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
maybe have some live
Basically,
tests off to the side that I run just to make sure they run without errors.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So
So
those don't run
basically,
without my keys in there.
yeah. Okay. You have like two free approaches, basically. One that you
Yeah.
would go with maybe for as a heavyweight solution, doing the VCR thing, because it needs
Hmm.
some setup, it needs additional work. If you're on a team, it also
Right.
needs like additional education. It's kind
Right.
of a little bit of a mind shift. And then
Yeah.
for maybe the
Typically, I
quick
stub it
and
first, but yeah, I'll
yeah,
go to VCR,
okay,
the other approach, the full approach, if it warrants it, and sometimes it does.
yeah, okay. And then, yeah, stubbing would mean you have your client, so to say, that
Hmm.
talks with the API. For example, the
Hmm.
Active Campaign gem gives you a client that has all these methods, create this, get
Right.
this. And then you make sure it's not like you stub it, it's not making the request, but you give it the
But it gives back
parameters,
a compatible data
whatever.
structure on the other end. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it can be like an object or whatever the Active
Mhm.
Campaign returns, like a hash or an object, or then you have to kind of
Right.
um,
And
implement it yourself.
right. And so typically what happens there is like the HTTP party. Keep wanting to say HTTP party. I'm just not going to worry about
Mhm.
saying it right, and you all know what I mean. But yeah, so the HTTP
I wouldn't
party
even know
response
what's an
is its
object.
own object, right? And so it responds to its own things. And so I have to stub out the response and say, you're going to return an object that responds to the same things as the response object from HTTP party, right?
Uh-huh.
And so whatever calls I'm doing internal to my library, they all get responded to by the stub because Ruby does duck typing, which is awesome. And so it's kind of the reverse of dependency injection, right? It's like I can give you any object as long as it responds to whatever I'm calling against it. And so I just make sure it's compatible with my stuff. And then I hope it doesn't go stale. And mostly that hasn't bit me. Typically what gets me to reach for something like VCR is if they are consistently iterating on their responses, or if the response is exceptionally complex and I have to deal with the complexity. Then I'll grab a VCR and say, hey, just store the whole thing. And then, I do like to run against a live system periodically, but sometimes the systems are so complicated it's just not worth trying to do it, right? The return on your time just doesn't make sense. And so if it's a fairly simple API and it's mission critical that I have the sanity check, then I'll say, okay, every week you're going to run these tests too, and they hit the live system, and we just make sure that we're still getting back what we expect. But typically then I have some dummy account, or like with Active Campaign, I'd have a handful of contacts that are tagged with a specific tag that's just a testing tag, right? And so I know not to change those, right?
Yeah.
Because the test is going to goof with them. And then anything I change from the test, I change back at the end.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I always create new accounts, basically.
Yeah, sometimes I don't want to pay for an extra account. If I can do that, that's what I do, right? But sometimes,
I understand.
Yeah, sometimes it's like, hey, you can have another account. It's $30 more. It's like, for testing, no.
Wow. Yeah. This is the issue with smaller APIs, whereas bigger APIs always have some development account, like, I don't know, Stripe, Salesforce, right? They always give you
they'll
like
give you a sandbox
version.
I think PayPal
Exactly.
You can set up a sandbox. So
but in those cases, the value of using VCR is, again, like what you said, right? It's considerably lower because their APIs are inherently very, very stable.
They're very stable. Yep.
So
and the other thing is that they're also widely used enough to where the gems handle pretty much everything. So I'm just testing everything that I put on top of that gem, right? And I just stub out the stuff I get from the gem. So I don't even have to worry about the API.
Yeah. Sometimes the good, or the nicer thing of still using VCR, or an advantage, is that you need to write less code, like less stub code, because it records once, it's all there. And if your method does 10 calls and you try to test drive it or to change it, you always have these stubs that you need to maintain and write on the way. So this is like the disadvantage of using stubs.
Absolutely. And it's that's why a lot of it just depends, right? So I mean, people look for the silver bullet. There really isn't one. And sometimes you just kind of get stuck in this place with the API where it just sucks, because it just, there's just not a nice way to do what you want to do.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I've given feedback to places like, your system is no fun to work on, right? And it's like, hey, if you change these handful of things, right, keep the old API so that anybody using them can still use them, but create these nice APIs, right? Put it out there as your 2.0, or put it out there as, hey, we had some, You can tell them I'm an expert and just say, hey, we had an expert tell us that these things would make it real convenient to work on. So we're adding these endpoints, but the old endpoints work, and anything that depends on those endpoints will continue to work. We're not doing anything with them. But yeah.
Yeah, changing APIs is like its
Yep.
own story. Have you ever run into team cultural things where you would like to do testing in a certain way, test your loggers in a certain way, or test your APIs in a certain way, but then it's kind of, you see that it will be difficult to adopt in a team. Have you run
right
ever maybe something like a VCR or something?
So typically when I'm on a team, they either have something that's already in place, right? And so if that's the case, I can just come in and say, hey, I'd like to do this. And everybody just kind of goes, all right, right? Most people are willing to at least try it. Or, and this is the much, 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 much more common case, they're not tested. And if they ever did, those tests are old. And so in that case, I can do whatever I want. But the problem is that since I'm the only person running the tests, if somebody else breaks the test, then I may complain and not get any traction on getting it fixed.
Oh yeah.
So
that's tough.
And getting buy-in from that level, it's hard because effectively they look at it and they see where things are at, and all they see is a ton of work that doesn't actually move things forward. And no matter how many times you explain to them, hey, look, having these tests run is a sanity check that we won't break stuff, and it allows us to move faster because at the end of the day, it keeps us from adding technical debt in a number of meaningful ways. And so we ought to do it. It just, they either believe it or they don't. And by believe it, not say they believe it, right? They actually feel it, right? They feel the momentum that they get from it, right? And one example of this, and it was with this last client, right? They had, and I'm not going to go into all the issues in the code base, right? And I mean, it worked and, got the job done, but they had a bunch of globals throughout the program. They had, I think the method was 150 to 200 lines that did most of the work, and it still farmed stuff out to other classes. Just stuff like that. And so, I put tests around a lot of it and then came in and cleaned up a lot of it because it made it easier to test, but it also made it a lot easier to read and work on. And so all of a sudden our velocity went up because of the positive changes in the code. Right. And so sometimes it's not just, hey, we're confident in our changes and therefore we can move faster, but it was also, we could find where stuff got done because it made sense where to look for it, right? And the code was easy enough to follow to where if you didn't know, you could find it real easy, right? It's like, oh, well, it's obviously going to be part of this process. And then you look at that, okay, it's going to be part of the second step of the process. Okay, this is making a direct call to a class that says that it does exactly what I'm looking for it to do, right? And you were on the book club. Were you on the book club when we talked to Bob about clean architecture? A lot of this stuff comes out of clean code.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
But a lot of this stuff comes out of clean code, right? So it's named well, it's neatly partitioned into components and, all the stuff that we talked about there. But yeah, so, it makes a difference in that way as well. And people kind of have to see it to understand it. So getting people to buy into testing, yeah. I mean, I just went and did it when I was waiting for them to answer a question I had, or I went and cleaned it up when I was hung up on something and waiting for the support on one of the APIs to get back to me, or things like that. And it was a pretty massive I didn't get it completely done. And in fact, when I left, when the contract ended, I submitted like 6 PRs, right? Because I just kept finding and cleaning more stuff. And so I was like, hey, this is going to get you like 80% of the cleanup that you needed, right? But yeah, them seeing it, it was like, oh, you saw some light bulbs go on. But yeah, getting
Hmm.
buy-in is, if you're already doing testing, typically you can say, hey, I'd like to try this in our testing, and people are like, oh, okay. But if you're not, then they don't care what you do unless somebody else is running the tests as well. But it's also hard to get them to see the value.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that you say it was the testing buy-in because I'm in my bubble of uh, having worked in teams,
Mm-hmm.
at least in the Rails world, where they were into, and Ruby world, where they were into testing. And
Mm-hmm.
it's also sad that um, the Ruby community is a lot into testing. And then, yeah, every now and then I hear about Rails projects or Ruby projects where there is no tests. And I'm
Right.
just like, I can't even imagine anymore how it is, how exciting it is to push code to a large code base that doesn't have tests. I would like to experience this again someday. But on the other hand, I'm really happy to work
Yeah.
on well-tested code bases that actually give me like some confidence in what
Right.
I'm pushing out there.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other piece, is that the value of testing goes up with more people working on the project, right? Because then at that point, I can encode my assumptions. And then if you come in and you misunderstand one of the assumptions that I made when I wrote the code that's critical to its functioning, and you break the assumption, it'll tell you, right? Instead of coming back later and going, why did this break? Who was the last person to work on this? How do I even track down where the problem is, right? It just comes up and says, hey, you failed 2 unit tests here and an integration test. So this is what you broke, right?
Yeah.
So,
And this is why I also like, now we are getting a little bit into the nitty-gritty details, but I really like to, in my test names, to really say what I expect, the
mm-hmm.
assumption, like you said it, like
Yep.
the actual assumption of what should be returned, and not like testing this
Yep.
method.
Yeah. Test when I do this, I get this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, anyway, yeah. Well, we're kind of toward the end of our hour. We've been talking for a whole hour. Can you believe that, Rich?
No,
Um,
no, I can't.
but yeah, I mean, I could talk about testing and stuff all day, and I have to admit that some of the projects that I've started since I was the only person working on them, I didn't start them with tests, and I wish I had now, right? Because they've either gotten complicated, or I'm looking to bring somebody on to work on some of the project, to add stuff to it, and it's like I don't even know how to begin to tell them what all is in here. And then the other thing is that um, there's a certain level of complexity that I want to take out, because it was like, okay, I started going down this road and then I figured out there was a better way, but I'd already committed part of the other solution and I'm not using it, right? And if I'm not using it,
Mhm.
I don't want anything to run it. And the best way to know that it's not getting run is to take it out. So,
Yeah.
and I'm sure testing to a certain degree can help you with that too, just from the standpoint of, you know, I mean, Rails makes it somewhat easy because usually things are named after what they are. And so it's like, okay, like in top end devs, there's an admin user class. And I combined the admin app with the user, or with the regular app. And so nothing accesses the admin user anymore. So I just need to put in a migration to drop the table and rip it out, because nothing touches it anymore. So I've got dead code in
Mhm.
there, and we could talk about that too. But um, I don't know. Just it's kind of hard to track
Yeah,
that stuff down.
I will see this as an invitation to fulfill my dreams of pushing code into a code base that doesn't have a lot of tests. If you have some lying around, but it also
Yeah,
goes back to to what we said in the beginning was, well, you can test your loggers, you can test your APIs, you can test things that don't exist anymore. But
right.
ideally, it would be good to always keep your tests on target and
Hmm.
to make them test behavior and test actual
Yeah,
things that users will experience.
yeah, 100%. All right, well, let's go ahead and move on to picks. So I'll go ahead and start
Let's
us
do
off.
it.
I've got all kinds of stuff to pick. So last week was Mother's Day, or this Sunday was Mother's Day, this last Sunday. And I got my wife a couple of things. She's really into gnomes. And so
Nope.
I gnomes. They're the little
Like
men with
the
the beards and
little
the
thing.
hats.
Okay.
And so yeah, I got her some gnome stuff, but the other thing I got her was, and this is kind of cool, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but it's called Skylight, and you can get it on Amazon. You can also get it directly from them. I think I hit an ad on Instagram that gave me a discount, but I got the Skylight calendar, and I'll put a link in here. So what it does is it, and I can go into some of the other stuff too. I got some kind of funny related stuff to talk about, but anyway, it's a calendar for the family, right? And then it does chore tracking. You can put your shopping list in it. You can put a to-do list in it, right? So my wife and I are looking at remodeling part of the house, right? So we may put some of the to-dos in there for that. What else does it do? Meal planning. Did I say that already? Anyway,
No.
so it just comes with a little stand, so you just sit it on your counter. The one I got is 15 inches. Don't ask me how many centimeters that is because I don't have a clue.
30 something
So
probably.
probably. So anyway, so yeah, so it's just it's kind of like an Amazon Echo. It sits on your counter and does all that stuff. You can also add pictures to it, and then you can set it up so that when it goes to sleep, it'll rotate through your pictures or videos or whatever you put on it. And I have 5 kids, and I've been fighting them to get the chores done. That was another thing that was nice, is that I had set up a spreadsheet where I was keeping track of when they'd done their chores. It's more blank than I wish it was. But this allows them to just go into it and just check them off. And so when they think it's done, they can check it off, and then I can go look at the chore and I can let them know what they didn't do, and then I can go and uncheck it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's nice, just as a way to kind of have some accountability on that stuff. And one thing that I figured out, because initially I was just adding the chores to each day, and then I figured out that you can tell it to do it on a weekly basis, because our chores rotate every week. And some of the chores you only do like on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, like if you're washing a toilet or vacuuming a floor or something like that. And so I could tell it, hey, rotate this every 5 weeks, right? Because the chores just rotate one kid to the next. And so, yeah, I have to set it up 5 times, right? But then I'm done. And yeah, it has all the right chores on the right days. So anyway, I'm pretty happy with that. Pretty excited about it. It was like $300. So if you're looking for a solution to that, I'm just so tired of fighting the chores and stuff. So yeah, I'm gonna pick that. I
Yeah.
usually pick a board game. And I'm trying to think what I've played lately, because things have been a little bit insane the
I
last
can
few weeks, and I haven't played
pick
with my friends.
I can pick one for you if you want.
Oh, go ahead.
Well,
You have a board game?
you probably maybe you picked one, this one already sometime
Could
before,
be.
but I also have two kids. Well, the smaller one is not ready yet for board games. It's not even two. The bigger one is
Mm-hmm.
6, and it went quite well with him to play Carcassonne.
Oh,
It's a game where you build little streets, and you build these roads and then you close them off, and the more of your own kind of um, colors are on the streets that you've built that are closed, the
uh-huh.
more points you get, and um, yeah, the better, the sooner you get all the points that you can, the sooner you win. And it worked out well with my kids, so that's a good one if
Very
you have
cool.
kids.
Now that game has been around for a really, really long time, and I have never played it.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So
Yeah, exactly. It's this one.
I've
And we
heard good
played the
things.
junior edition.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna type it into Board Game Geek, but it looks like um oh, it's only been around since 2000. Anyway, it
Wow.
looks like it says that seven or older can play it. So that means
Yeah,
all of my kids
it's
can play it.
yeah, we played the junior edition. I think it
Uh-huh.
starts a little bit earlier there. I don't know what difference is, but
I
it
don't know.
worked.
Usually what happens is they take a rule or two out that make it hard. And
Hmm.
so then the kids don't have to manage as much complexity in their heads to come up with a
Oh
strategy
yeah.
that can win. Um, it also means that it's pretty easy for adults to nail down and win. But yeah, it looks like it's Board Game Geek weights it at 1.9, which is, you know, kind of a family friendly casual game. Um, 30 to 45-minute gameplay, 2 to 5 players. So yeah, very cool. Yeah, we played a game that has artwork that's similar to this, and I'm trying to remember what it's called. I might have picked it. So if I think of it, then I'll pick it out. But otherwise, um, yeah. And then the other pick that I have, so I have two more picks. One is that I just bought a new camera. It's right here actually, and it looks. So if you're watching the video, it's a
Mm-hmm.
Nikon D7500. The camera that
Mm-hmm.
I have used for the videos to date, that's up there, is a Nikon D5600, and so the 7500's a few years newer, but the feature that I needed is if I so and the reason that I'm not using the camera right now to record Ruby Rogues and use the green screen and everything, besides the fact that I need to change out my lights, is that the D5600 will turn itself off after a half hour, and you cannot make it go longer than that. And so if I want to record a longer video and use the green screen and everything else, then I actually have to tell it to wind the shutter to turn back on, right? And
Okay.
so my screen will go
Well,
black in the middle of the recording. And
wow, why is
so
that?
I think they're worried about it overheating and stuff. The
Oh,
D70 7500, you can set it to just not turn off. Now, they warn you, right, that it might overheat if you do that. But since the only thing I'm using my camera for is effectively for to be a really nice webcam, right, because it connects to the Blackmagic ATEM Mini, right, and then streams into my computer. So, I can get away with having it on for an hour or so. And so that's one thing that I'm changing up. I also bought some lights on Amazon. So I got the camera on eBay, and they said it was just the base unit. Um, like that was it. It said base unit only. It wasn't the base
hmm.
unit only. You saw it had a lens on it. I don't know if the
Hmm.
lenses are compatible, but if they aren't, then I'll just use this to do my other photography stuff. Um, let my kids go take pictures with it. It was kind of an expensive camera. But anyway, so yeah, so I got it on eBay, so I'm just going to shout that out too. And then the other pick I have, so I did order some lights. And if you go to Top End Devs right now, by the time you watch it, I don't know if I will have changed it out or not. But one of the issues that I had was that you can see the ring lights behind me if you're watching the video. And if not, I have ring lights behind me. And then I've got some lights up when I stand up that shine on my head. Well, the problem is that the light's kind of harsh. And so what happens is if I'm wearing my glasses, and I like the way I look with my glasses on. I'd rather record. I feel like I look haggard without them on. It casts a shadow from the glasses onto my face. And so my issue was that I needed kind of a softer light. And so what I wound up buying is I bought these lights. They're FovTech. I'll put a link in the show notes. They had a kit with 3 lights in it. So one is set up to kind of, or 2 of them are set up to be kind of your main key light, right? So if my right side of my face was going to be lit up, you're getting way more information than you wanted. I am rambling, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to keep rambling until I'm done. But anyway, so the nice thing about the kit is that, yeah, so it has 2 of those key lights, and then it has a third light that's on a boom that you can use to light from the side. Okay. And so, and then the other thing you probably ought to know is that in order to properly use a green screen, you have to light the green screen too. And you have to light it in a way that does not cast a shadow from you onto the green screen. Otherwise, you get a different color green, and it's harder to make it work, right? And so I was running into issues there because I had to broaden the color of green that it would use. And so, and then the shadows on my face, anyway, it was actually putting some of the background onto my face, which was weird, but I posted the video anyway. And I'm super picky. So anyway, so these lights will allow me to light everything evenly because it's a softer light, and so it spreads. And because it's a softer light from a larger area, it doesn't cast a sharp shadow on my glasses, right, onto my face, because it'll light it from above it and below it. And so anyway, that's why I got new lighting, and I'm looking forward to recording some stuff. I'm planning on recording a crap ton of the Developer Career Momentum podcast, which is the one that you get when you enter your email address on the website. And then the other thing I'm going to be doing is the Catapult Your Coding Career. And I've recorded a few of those. I actually recorded some of them in my truck. I guess I should pick those microphones too, because the microphone I use in my truck just plugs into my phone, which is nice. So I'll pick that too. And so I'll tell you about that in a minute. But yeah, so that's what I'm using it for, and that way I can put up a video with some kind of interesting background, and I can also I can also record whatever, however I want. I can do it on the podcast and stuff like that. So the microphone, it's actually a little lavalier mic. I'll have to search my orders here real quick. But what it is it has, and I'll hold it up to the camera, but I can just explain it if you're on audio only. But it has a receiver, and it's just this little, it's just a little piece of hardware, right? And it has an adapter for my iPhone, right? It has the USB-C, like and it has an adapter. Dongle, yeah. And so I just plug it into the bottom of my phone, and then it came with 2 lavalier mics that I just clip onto my shirt somewhere, and then I can just talk at it, and it sounds good. It doesn't sound like my microphone that I'm talking on now does, but if I'm out and about, then I can use it. And the thing that I like there is I'm also going to be putting more videos up on Twitter and TikTok and Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that. And so those will be like 60-second videos that probably aren't going to wind up on the podcast feed, but they'll wind up as shorts and reels and whatever else you call them on YouTube and what have you. So, it'll just be hey, I saw this and it made me think of that. Right. And so, you're going to get a lot of object lessons there. I did one just talking briefly about something I did a test run of them and I thought they sounded great. And they were like $36, $36 on Amazon. So that was a good deal. Anyway, I am picking a ton of equipment that you probably all don't necessarily need to care about, but in case you're trying to get into recording, and if you get into top end devs and you start doing what I recommend that you do, you will. These are all things that can kind of help you out. I am going to be traveling to Amsterdam in about a week and a half, 2 weeks. I think it's 2 weeks.
Nice to have you here.
Yeah, right. So, I can just record stuff in the airport or whatever, right? I can just, pop the microphone on me, find a place where the lighting doesn't totally suck, and record a quick video and just be like, hey, I'm on my way. Or, hey, there was a lady that walked by that was wearing a weird t-shirt that didn't fit her right, and it made me think of testing, or whatever I come up with. So anyway, but yeah, so those are my picks. Sorry, I rambled a ton. Y'all asked for it, I guess. I haven't been on this show for a few weeks just because I've been fighting all this other stuff. So I'm back. Yeah. Rich, what are your picks?
It's a whole science, right? With the video audio setup. We are also having our Curious Coders Chronicles podcast where we try to figure stuff out. And we are doing it now for a couple of months and we are still trying to figure stuff out. So this is actually a very helpful workshop and like recommendations. Maybe as part of your course there, or like RSS feed
there.
That's
the plan.
Maybe you could have like a session about setup and things like that.
I'm planning on having, so on Top End Devs, I'm planning on having one of the series be about building your personal brand. And so I'll talk about this equipment and stuff. But if you get into it and you start doing things like I tell you to, you're going to start ugly, right? You're not going to go buy gobs of expensive equipment, right? You're going to go get a $20 or $30 microphone that is better than your onboard computer microphone, and you're going to start recording, right? And you may wind up using the webcam that's built into your laptop, and that is totally fine, right? What you'll figure out is as you go, it's like, oh, okay, I've done like 10 or 15 of these, right? And that's where I got with the video stuff, because I've been doing audio for 13 years. I've been doing audio for 17 years. But, the video stuff was all new to me and the green screen stuff was all new to me. But I wanted to have some fun with it. I wanted to try some new stuff. And so I started ugly, right? I started with the lights I already had, right? Because my wife got me the ring lights for Christmas a couple of years ago. And I don't even remember what I bought these other lights for, but they just didn't work out, right? So I kept recording stuff with them until the other lights came, right? So the other lights are waiting to be set up. And so, I'll spend an hour or two setting up the lights instead of recording because I have them now. But in the meantime, don't stress if you don't have the nice microphone and the nice, whatever, right? It's, the microphone I started with was a $50 microphone. The microphone I use today is a $350 microphone. And the reason is because I use it all the time. And I got to the point where I was using it as part of my business. And so it made a lot of sense to invest in something that sounded really, really nice. But if you're doing it to build your personal brand and you just want to put content out there and it's kind of a hobby, you don't need a $350 microphone, right? You need something that sounds okay, right? And most of the microphones that cost more than $50 or $60, they sound fine. And nobody's going to think, oh, he's on a cheaper mic, right? The difference between this mic and the other mic, honestly, you're probably not, most people are not going to hear it. And the people who do hear it are going to have like some really high fidelity headphones on, and they're going to go, oh yeah, this sounds crisper than the other one. if they're really into it and they really care. And that show starts right after this one. So
Oh yeah.
yeah, I can't just let it slide with the, hey, I just picked all this equipment and make it sound like you need it, because you don't, right? I'm doing it because I'm going to be doing trainings with it. I'm going to be doing podcasts with it. I'm going to be doing YouTube videos with it, and I can afford it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
anyway,
totally.
sorry.
I
Rant
also would
over.
just I can just sign that getting started goes over everything
Yeah.
else, and
Yeah.
iterating and then improving over time is the way
Yeah.
to go.
But I will put
In
content
which
up and
direction?
explain how to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that would be cool. And yeah, my picks also go to into a similar direction. I try to make them quick. One of them is the Top and Devs Book Club. Just as a little thank you for setting it up. I had a lot of fun with the sessions that we had together,
Mm-hmm.
and where we read the Pragmatic Programmer book,
Mm-hmm.
and we had like we had great conversations, I think, and then the authors even were there, and I
Mm-hmm.
think before that Robert C. Martin was there, so it's a
Yeah.
pretty cool thing. And yeah, I hope there's you're doing right now the 7 languages in 7 weeks, I
Yep.
think.
7 languages in 7 weeks. And we had Bruce Tate. He actually came on the call on Tuesday, and he's
Oh.
going to come on again at the end of the book when we do Haskell. I think is the last one. So he's going to come on for the
Mm.
Haskell chapter. But yeah, some people are like, well, can I come in the middle of the book? Yeah, you can, because you just read the chapter we're reading. This book's
Yeah.
especially approachable that way, because each chapter is kind of self-contained as far
Yeah.
as learning the language thing. So anyway, definitely come check it out. If you use the code Ruby Rogues, then you can come do it for 2 weeks with us for free, and then after that, you have to pay. But yeah,
Nice.
that's been super fun. That's
Nice.
been one of the best things I ever did for myself, is just be able to talk to all you cool guys about this stuff. I love having conversations about this stuff.
Yeah, and my other pick would be coding challenges. Kind of I liked them when I just started getting programming. I don't know, 7, 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of found them to be, or I thought maybe they're a waste of time, and I almost never or avoided like interviews and interview processes that are heavy on coding challenges. But then I thought I'll make it like a mental challenge for myself to beat the hardest coding challenge out there, which
Mm-hmm.
or one of the hardest one, which is the Top Tau coding challenge.
Oh, interesting. I haven't
And
heard of that
yeah,
one.
yeah, it's a Top Tau is a freelancer platform,
Mm-hmm.
and I tried this coding challenge 3 years ago. I failed miserably, and since then it's stuck in my mind, and I just want to do it, just not because I necessarily very much need to get on the platform, but just to beat the coding challenge and to beat my own brain. And because it's also a specialized skill, it's a little bit of math, a little bit of puzzling, a little bit of this and that, and it can be fun actually. And yeah, I'll be doing that. I'll maybe will be streaming that. Probably I should actually do pick one language from the 7 languages book and do it in this language, a
You
challenge
do it in
there, and
Prologue.
visit you. Yeah, and visit you guys there
Yeah, absolutely.
in the book club again. Yeah, this is what I'm up to at the moment. And I don't know if I'll get this project done by the end of the year, because it takes time and get into this whole mindset of
Right.
coding challenges. And but yeah, let's see how it goes.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, a few other things I just want to throw out there. If people are looking for you, it's richstone.io. That's where your blog lives.
Oh, thanks.
And
Yeah.
what's your Twitter and GitHub?
It's Richstone.io is my Twitter, and Richstone, it came before Richstone.io. So Richstone is my GitHub.
Very cool. All right. Well, thanks for coming on and talking testing. I love diving into that.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. Till
Thanks for
next
the
time,
invite.
folks. Max out.